And good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be here with you on what is our fifth session in the series entitled The Black Education Experience in the United States, Testaments of Courage, Freedom, Resilience, and Dignity. Over the course of this series, we are looking at the ways in which the African American community has engaged in both innovation, ingenuity, acts of resistance, all toward the effort of expanding our understandings of democracy in this country through the fields of education and the pursuit of educational equity. Today's session, the revelation of Black studies, from protest to empowerment. The most lasting impact of the Black Power movement was how it changed Black people's perception. The self-hatred imposed by segregation's apartheid value system that prioritized whiteness at the pinnacle of an oppressive system that was standard for all fields and statuses within the society was shed by Black people during this period under the shining light of Black activism. No better leader articulated this shift in consciousness than Malcolm X. It is no coincidence that within a year of his assassination, three central phases or phrases that he either coined or initiated would take hold and form in three separate yet connected movements. That being the movements of Kwanzaa, what we now understand as the holiday of Kwanzaa, also the Black Panther Party for self-defense, as well as the Black arts movement itself. With Kwanzaa established in Los Angeles in 1966 as a practice for African American people, as a point of pride, to take pride in our heritage, in the history and achievements and struggle of Black people throughout the world. The vision articulated by Malcolm X with respect to Black power, the understanding that Black people have the capacity to achieve their own ends. This concept is understood today as self-determination, would take form in the development of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. I share this picture here specifically to offset and even counter the often sensationalized image of Black Panthers bearing guns. That was only a minimal aspect of the actual daily work that they did. This here is depicting a Black Panther member serving breakfast to children before they're going to school, which became a practice of the Panthers that in fact preceded the free breakfast programs that now are evidenced in many public schools across this country. In addition, the Panthers also enacted health clinics, providing free health care for African Americans in poor communities. The concept of Black is beautiful that countered the generations old idea of Blackness being ugly, Blackness being that which you despise. You would call each other Black as a disparaging term. Black took on a new understanding during this period as beautiful, heard in the songs of James Brown and Aretha Franklin and others. The Black arts movement, headed up by the likes of Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, and others, would embody in the literature of this period of working class Black folks an idea and conception, a self-concept that articulated a notion of beauty that ran counter to and was an act of resistance to the white dominant conception of beauty that prioritized blonde hair and blue eyes. These phrases, Black is beautiful, Black power, Black pride, took on new meaning and magnitude for a people who had been taught to despise their color and denigrate their own culture. These movements would be synthesized in the rise of Black studies on college campuses across the country. This did not happen by happenstance, of course, as if there's anything that we've learned across these sessions, is that whatever Black people have achieved in this society has occurred as a consequence of organized struggle. The development of the first Black studies program in this country in higher education came as the consequence of what is, to history, the longest student strike in United States history. San Francisco State, then college, now university, the development of what would become Black studies was, in fact, occurred under these conditions. When we read the history, we learn that there were other students on the campus, of course, who were also not white, and were also concerned about their civil rights, were also concerned for equal rights, and were also concerned for the ways in which their history was being taught in the curriculum. They would join in with the African-American students on campus and develop something that would be called the Third World Organization. This group, called the Third World Liberation Front, which comprised Asian American students, Latinx students, Arab American students, and others, Native American students, were a clear effort to not just align with the demands being put forward by the Black students on campus, but also reflected their own understanding of the necessity of struggle with respect to their own communities. Many of these communities were, many of these students were first generation immigrants themselves and had came to this country with notions of, America is the promised land, and if you work hard and you do this and do that, and those dreams and myths were clearly put to the side very quickly during this period of turmoil in this country on the question of civil rights. One of the founding members of the Third World Liberation Front, Lenata Warjack, a Native American student there, states, "It's very important to acknowledge us as a people with a culture and not to just leave us without any kind of acknowledgement. To keep us without any recognition or acknowledgement is to say that we don't exist, and we do." This was the attitude of students involved in this student strike. It was a demand for acknowledgement, a demand that our history, our culture, our thinking, our notions, our desires are necessary and they matter. Clearly, as you can see here, students were not met with welcomed hands by the administration, and as a consequence would engage in sit-ins to express, taking a tactic from the civil rights movement, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, those students that actually went into Black communities to register Black folks to vote, and the struggles that they experienced to integrate the restaurants in segregated America. They took those same tactics, brought them onto the campus to achieve their ends. When it was all said and done, Mariah Bohannon, in Insight into Diversity, the December 2019 issue, in her article, African American History, a look back at early student activism, states that by the end of the Black campus movement in 1972, 13 students had been killed during campus demonstrations and more than 100 college presidents were ousted. It is estimated that students at 1,000 institutions across 49 states engaged in campus activism to demand better treatment and support of African American students, employees, and communities during this time period. Their efforts soon spurred similar movements for other marginalized student groups and helped propel the ongoing struggle for equity in higher education. Where are we today? In light of this history, in light of the bloody history and the efforts that working class Black students and other students of color made during what is likely one of the most tumultuous periods in American history, we need to sit back and then reflect on, you know, where have we come? How far have we come? So let's consider that. In a report that was done maybe about a decade ago, it was determined that after investigating 1,777 college campuses across the country, they found that 20% of those campuses had formal Black studies or African American studies departments. Another 50% had Black studies courses, not whole departments, not major departments, but courses taught in those schools. They also found that 50% of this 20% that had formal departments, 50% of that 20% also were housed in colleges that also had an attendant Latinx studies component. If we reflect on the fact that there were demands that were made by those students that led to the development of what today we understand as Black studies or African American studies programs and ethnic studies across the board, among other developments, we might want to ask what then would be the most critical demand of Black students today, understanding, given, again, the lessons that we've learned up to this point, the struggle for educational equity is still ongoing in this nation. Student debt is the most critical conversation that is had today with respect to the realities faced by incoming as well as students who have graduated from college campuses. That reality is even more critical for African American students. In an article published in Forbes magazine just this summer entitled "Cancel Black Student Debt as Reparations," the writer indicates that's why 31%, when discussing this question of student debt overall, he says that's why 31% of Black families have education loans compared with only 20% of white families, despite the fact that Black students go to college at a lower rate than white students. And worse, once Black students graduate, they face a discriminatory labor market that pays them less. So they've borrowed more, but can't recoup the costs of their degrees at the same rate as others. Borrowing more, but making less is connected to higher default rates. Research shows that the median Black graduate with a bachelor's degree is more likely to default on their student loans than a white student who dropped out of college with student debt. That's an astounding finding, given that on average, students who don't finish are most likely to default. Now, this is very telling and sobering, that the rate for Black graduates with respect to defaulting on loans is higher than those white students who actually drop out of college. In a conversation that was held by the NAACP most recently on the question of the realities facing Black college students and Black graduates of college of colleges, and this question of student debt, Karan Blair, who is the executive director of the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, shared this. He says, "We are clear that education justice cannot be separated from the conversation about racial justice. The inequities observed in K through 12 and higher education spaces are deeply connected to the legacy and continued prevalence of racism in this country." And so, when we talk about student debt, we are talking profoundly about a racial justice issue. And it is my sincere hope that by this point in our series, no one should have a doubt as to why that is so. What you see here is a picture that many folks who are watching this likely recall. This is a picture of African-American students at Howard University, just a few days following the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, by the police there. Young Michael Brown, as you recall, was a young man, 18, 19 years of age, who was shot and killed in broad daylight. 6 bullets riddled his body before it fell there on the ground and was left there in that street for over 4 hours. It became a lightning rod of protest across this country that in fact sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. Michael Brown and the development of the Black Lives Matter movement and the way in which Black college students took to the streets, organized on their campus in relationship to this demand signals a connection back to this history. Just as the students of the 60s who recognized their critical relationship to their home communities and to the conditions that those folk were faced with and resisting against, brought those concerns in their bodies to those campuses and sought to achieve equity with respect to the experiences they were having on those campuses as well. In fact, that student strike that I shared with you at the start of this presentation that led to the development of the first Black Studies program in this country, at a college in this country, was the direct consequence of also an act of police violence, no different than what occurred on August 4, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. September 27, 1966, Matthew Johnson, shot and killed by police, a 16-year-old boy, shot and killed by police in San Francisco. This event is the decisive event that would lead to Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, both college students, to develop the Black Panther Party for self-defense 1 month later. What you see here is the newspaper of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that famed organization that was responsible for, again, registering folks during the civil rights movements to vote throughout the South. It was an interracial organization. The California chapter's newsletter covered this story. What you see there is the picture of Matthew Johnson's casket, the age of 16. 1 month later, Huey Newton, who had been a part of a Black Studies cadre in the campus where he attended college, was studying the history of Black people, was engaged in conversation on the affairs of the time in which he was alive, recognized that there needed to be, that something needed to be done. And he decided, with his friend Bobby Seale, to develop the Black Panther Party for self-defense as a consequence. And on October 15, 1966, indeed, the Black Panther Party for self-defense would become a reality. How this ties directly to the student strike, the Black student strike at San Francisco State that would lead to the first Black Studies program, is because the Minister of Education for the Black Panther Party would be terminated. He was also a grad student at San Francisco State who was an instructor in the English program. When the trustee board of the college learned that he was an active member of the Black Panthers, they fired him. That was the spark that led to Black students organizing on that campus. In an NPR interview, March 21st, 2019, entitled "The Student Strike That Changed Higher Ed Forever," it reads, "One of the most prominent on-campus organizers at San Francisco State was George Murray, a popular graduate student who taught freshman English. Murray had a second job as the Minister of Education for the Black Panther Party. He was fiercely anti-Vietnam, and his politics got him suspended from campus in 1968. And that was it. The strike kicked off," said Jerry Vernado, who was co-founder of the first Black Student Union at San Francisco State. So what does this all teach us? The events of the past, the events of the present should make clear that an unequal system is an unjust system. An unjust system can only be maintained through violence because no self-respecting people ever accepts inequality and injustice. As it was true then, and as is true today, Black students on college campuses are connected to the communities from which they come, the hopes and aspirations of their families that they carry forward matter. And as a consequence of that relationship that cannot be severed, there will always be a response from those who are attending colleges of higher learning regarding the concerns that are being faced by those they left behind in their homes, in their home communities. What this teaches us is that Black resistance matters. As I shared before, you cannot name me any advancement that has been made by African Americans in this country that did not come as a consequence of struggle, and not just struggle, but organized struggle. The realities that Black folk face to this day, as we're getting closer to the conclusion of our series, and the point of the series was to help people appreciate what Black Lives Matter is all about, why it is here, what are the conditions that led to its rise, and what then ought to be done to help to ensure that the causes for which Black Lives Matter is here will not have to be repeated. Clearly, as we've seen in this nation's history, there is a cycle of oppression that Black people have been forced to face. Every generation has been made to be confronted by white supremacist violence in the bodies of white citizens, as well as that promoted by and accepted by and supported by the state in the bodies of those who are given the badge to so-called protect and serve. These are the questions of our time. And what we must always remember is that if we are to get on the right side of history, the right side of history is always on the side of resistance to oppression. That is our lesson. And that Black studies is the mode through which not just the articulation of the history of Black people, but the study of and the analysis of the struggles of Black people to not just benefit Black folks, but again, to enlarge what we understand as democracy, justice, and equality for all people. And if you needed a lesson on that, all you need to do is read the front page of the news today to witness how those that are against democracy, equality, and justice are going out of their way to deny reality itself and to target the efforts made, the democratic effort made by Black people to have their voice heard in this prior election. The times we're living in are quite challenging. But the best avenue to appreciate and understand what must be done at this hour is through the avenue of what Black people have always done in this society. For those that are interested in learning more about this history, you are highly encouraged to consider these 3 critical books: Changing Academia Forever, Black Student Leaders Analyze the Movement They Led, by Kitty Kelly Epstein and Bernard Stringer; White Money, Black Power, The Surprising History of African American Studies and the Crisis of Race in Higher Education, by Noliwe M. Rooks; The Black Campus Movement, Black Students in the Racial Reconstitution of Higher Education, 1965 to 1972, by Ibram H. Rogers. And those that are ready to dive even deeper, if you belong to an institution on the college campus or elsewhere in the nonprofit world and want to explore these ideas and want to figure out how to do this work with respect to your institution to further the work of equity and justice, I invite you to consider the consultation of the organization that I found, Origin. And check us out. Our website is racial-justice.org. And it is always a pleasure to do this work with the Kaplan Education Foundation as they continue to do this work. This organization is that bridge from this very past that we discussed, as they try to widen the gates of inclusion on college campuses across this country. It is indeed my honor to be a part of this organization partnering in this particular way at this time. Thank you so much.